As the new Attorney General, William Barr, today started his first day on the job as the head of the Justice Department, leading the husband of one senior White House staffer to proclaim online that William Barr starting as AG means, quote, Mueller will soon be gone. As William Barr took the reins at the Justice Department for his first day today, this is what prosecutors in Robert Mueller's office told a federal judge tonight. Who is starting the sentencing process for President Trump's campaign chairman, Paul J. Manafort. This is what they told the judge. Quote, the United States of America, by and through Special Counsel Robert S. Mueller, files this submission to address the sentencing of defendant Paul J. Manafort, Jr. As an initial matter, the government agrees with the guidelines analysis in the pre-sentence investigation report and its calculation of the defendant's total offense level as 38. With a corresponding range of imprisonment of 235 to 293 months. That's 19 and a half years to 24 and a half years in prison. A fine range of $50,000 to $24.4 million, restitution in the amount of $24.8 million, and forfeiture in the amount of $4.4 million. The defendant stands convicted of the serious crimes of tax fraud, bank fraud, and failing to file a foreign bank account report. Manafort was the lead perpetrator and a direct beneficiary of each offense. And while some of these offenses are commonly prosecuted, there was nothing ordinary about the millions of dollars involved in the defendant's crimes, the duration of his criminal conduct, or the sophistication of his schemes. Footnote 1. Footnote 1 reads, quote, Manafort was being investigated prior to the May 2017 appointment of the special counsel by prosecutors in this district, meaning in the Eastern District of Virginia, and by prosecutors in the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice. Oh, they were already pursuing Manafort before Mueller was ever appointed. Quote, Manafort committed these crimes over an extended period of time from at least 2010 to 2016. His criminal decisions were not momentary or limited in time. They were routine. And Manafort's repeated misrepresentations to financial institutions were brazen, at least some of which were made at a time when he was the subject of significant national attention. Neither the probation department nor the government is aware of any mitigating factors. Manafort did not commit these crimes out of necessity or hardship. He was well-educated, professionally successful, and financially well off. He nonetheless cheated the U.S. Treasury and the public out of more than $6 million in taxes at a time when he had substantial resources. Manafort committed bank fraud to supplement his liquidity because his lavish spending exhausted his substantial cash resources when his overseas income dwindled. Finally, Manafort pled guilty in September 2018 in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia to other crimes committed over an even longer period. The government references those crimes below in particular because they demonstrate the defendant's concerted criminality, including the conduct to which he pled guilty from as early as 2005 and continuing up until the defendant's involvement in an obstruction of justice conspiracy between February and April of 2018, a crime Manafort committed while under indictment in 2 jurisdictions and subject to court-ordered bail conditions. Quote, in the end, Manafort acted for more than a decade as if he were above the law and deprived the federal government and various financial institutions of millions of dollars. The sentence here should reflect the seriousness of these crimes and serve to both deter Manafort and others from engaging in such conduct. Oof. No mitigating factors. In addition to there being no mitigating factors, prosecutors also tell the judge that Manafort deserves an enhancement of his sentence because he was effectively the leader of other people in committing this criminal scheme. Quote, Manafort controlled the money at issue, he recruited others to facilitate these crimes, and he claimed a larger share of the proceeds. Further, Manafort was plainly the leader. He involved numerous individuals who were both knowing and unknowing participants in the criminal scheme. These included Rick Gates and Konstantin Kilimnik, Manafort's tax preparers, his bookkeepers, and others in Cyprus who were involved in originating and maintaining the defendant's overseas accounts. Under the factors set forth in the guidelines, the leadership enhancement is warranted, which means there's something that gets colloquially referred to as the leadership enhancement that makes your sentence worse. They say he should get that. The prosecutors also say he deserves another sentence enhancement for using sophisticated means to commit his crimes. On page 19 of their submission, prosecutors say Manafort should be given 0 credit in his sentencing for accepting responsibility for his crimes. They say he should get no credit for that, in part because he didn't plead guilty to anything in the Virginia case, in part because he breached his cooperation agreement in the D.C. case and lied to prosecutors after he did plead guilty there. They say he also shouldn't get that, in part because even now he still isn't handing over the financial materials he's supposed to hand over as part of his sentencing process. And now here's the big windup from prosecutors against the president's campaign chairman. Quote, Manafort's history and characteristics are aggravating factors. Manafort has had every opportunity to succeed. He's well-educated and a member of the legal profession, attending Georgetown University for college and law school. He was a successful political consultant, both in the United States and abroad. There they footnote Rick Gates talking about how brilliant Manafort was at his job. Quote, Manafort's age does not eliminate the risk of recidivism he poses, particularly given that his pattern of criminal activity has occurred over more than a decade, and that the most recent crimes he pled guilty to occurred from February to April of last year, when he conspired to tamper with witnesses at a time when he was under indictment in 2 separate districts. Further, as Judge Jackson in D.C. found, Manafort's misconduct continued as recently as October 2018, when he repeatedly and intentionally lied to the government during proffer sessions and the grand jury. For a decade, Paul Manafort repeatedly violated the law. Considering only the crimes charged in this district, they make plain that Manafort chose to engage in a sophisticated scheme to hide millions of dollars from U.S. authorities. And when his foreign income stream dissipated in 2015, he chose to engage in a series of bank frauds in the U.S. to maintain his extravagant lifestyle at the expense of various financial institutions. Manafort chose to do this for no other reason than greed, evidencing his belief that the law doesn't apply to him. Manafort solicited numerous professionals and others to reap his ill-gotten gains. The sentence in this case must take into account the gravity of this conduct and serve to specifically deter Manafort and to deter those who would commit a similar series of crimes. And it's signed on behalf of the special counsel's office. They are recommending 19.5 years to 24.5 years in prison and fines and restitution of up to tens of millions of dollars. Now, this is just the filing from the prosecutors. We will now expect quickly to see a filing from Manafort's defense team that says, seriously, you guys, don't be crazy. He's a Boy Scout who missed a few merit badges. Community service would be more than appropriate, Your Honor. I'm paraphrasing what I expect, but given these guideline ranges, given the felonies that Manafort has been convicted of in this case, and given the fact that this is the first of Manafort's 2 federal sentencing processes, this is only the first judge who's going to sentence him. I think tonight what may be important for all of us here, not just for Paul Manafort as a person in this case, not just for the president's campaign chair in terms of what this says about the president's campaign, right? What may be important for the country here is that this is very much looking like the end of the line for Paul Manafort. I mean, what was he thinking in blowing up his plea deal by lying intentionally to prosecutors from the special counsel's office? I mean, he had to know they were going to catch him given everything else they caught him on. Well, the judge says one of the things Manafort intentionally lied to prosecutors about was the extent of his communications with the guy who prosecutors say is linked to Russian intelligence. Just think about that for a second. That's what he deliberately lied to prosecutors about, even after he had entered into a cooperation deal with them, when he knew that lying would be essentially a fatal offense. That means at great personal expense, at the cost of potentially dying in prison, Paul Manafort, the president's campaign chairman, lied to cover up the channel of communication, or at least a channel of communication, between the Trump campaign, when he was chairman, and Russian intelligence during the time that Russia was interfering in the U.S. presidential election to help his candidate, to help President Trump. He was deliberately lying to prosecutors about that. That is the lie that is going to cost Paul Manafort his last free breath. To cover up that channel of communication between the Trump campaign and Russian intelligence during the campaign, Paul Manafort is willing to die in prison. Is his effort to cover that up something that President Trump will see as worthy of a presidential pardon? Again, today was the first full day on the job for William Barr as Attorney General of the United States. This is his second time serving as Attorney General of the United States. The one thing he's famous for doing the first time he was AG in the administration of George H.W. Bush is that he was the driving force behind the infamous Christmas Eve 1992 pardons for 6 senior administration officials who were caught up in the Iran-Contra scandal, including the Secretary of Defense. 6 Iran-Contra figures pardoned on Christmas Eve by President Bush after Bush had already been voted out of office, but before the next president could be sworn in. William Barr is the one who recommended those pardons in Iran-Contra. The day he started as Attorney General, this president's campaign chairman received a sentence recommendation from prosecutors of 19 to 24 years in prison, plus tens of millions of dollars to pay. Like I said, it's all happening at once now.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.